I've argued there's a recurring theme that Southern labor is the key to understanding and changing American society. We won't get into that in too much detail, but we're going to talk about the failure of Operation Dixie. I was able to also read Ed Bruno's short piece, and I think we're mostly on the same page with respect to that. In some sense, Operation Dixie is a primer on how not to organize. So for the first question to be asked is, where in the South were unions successful in the 1930s and 1940s? First of all, they were successful in those industries that were organized in the North, in auto. And actually, the GM plant in Atlanta had a sit-down strike before the more famous Flint sit-down strike. Farm equipment, electrical, meat packing, and eventually rubber. The United Rubber Workers ended up organizing all the Southern plants. And they kept doing that until the mid-70s, even as some of them were bought by foreign companies. Some of the major Southern industries were organized: coal, steel, metal mining, longshore and maritime, tobacco, oil. And some of these are still important in the South and organized, oil and longshore in particular. And then there were industrial cities, some of which had historically had a lot of union activity: Atlanta, Birmingham, Tampa, Florida, New Orleans. But there were also a number of cities that had been violently anti-union and very racist, like Memphis, but also Gadsden, Alabama, Laurel, Mississippi. Those were places that were almost completely organized during the 1930s and 1940s. So the argument is, and I get asked this all the time, and I'm sure people do too, why aren't Southern workers more pro-union, or what happened? And I would argue that Southern workers, when given the chance, when they have sufficient leverage and associative power, are usually as ready and able to unionize as their compatriots in the North. So everybody thought this was a good time to organize the South. Unions throughout the country as a whole had gone up from 3 million to 14 million members. That meant that they had a lot more money, a lot more presence. Resistance to the unions in the South changed from having been very violent and extra legal to the type of resistance that we see today by most employers throughout the country, but particularly in the South. And there's a long history of organizing in the South. There's a picture of washerwomen in Atlanta, of which there were, it says here, thousands. But there are certainly many hundreds who unionized, struck. They had support from other unions. Coal miners organized, particularly in Alabama. There was a strike here. 90 workers were killed in Dolomite, Alabama, and they went on strike. This picture didn't come out so well. Southern textile, along with wood, were the two largest industries in the South. In 1934, there was a general strike in the textile industry, North and South. Southern textile workers across the South struck. Lots of them were killed by local police, National Guard, whatnot. So this is a sign from Operation Dixie from the CIO in 1946. There's a picture of tobacco workers who organized. And The CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, claimed that this was the most ambitious unionization attempt in U.S. history. The stakes were high. Unions in the North had always thought the South was important. And here's a quote from one of their supporters. It says, "On the day that the South is finally organized, the death knell will sound for the restrictions that deprive poor white and Negro of their votes. More information, better." It almost sounds like today, doesn't it? "More information, better education will follow in the wake of unionization. This spells the beginning of the end for the long domination by prejudice. Means a happy goodbye to the Bilbos." Bilbo is the racist senator from Mississippi, and Rankin was the most outspoken racist congressperson, also from Mississippi. Here's a sign from Operation Dixie. "Don't wait for the boss to do the right thing, join a union." And here's a billboard that was put up by business groups. And I think this one's from North Carolina, for some of you who are from North Carolina. Here's another one, familiar slogan. We're coming up on Labor Day weekend, so I figured I'd put that one in there. So there were a couple initial successes in Operation Dixie. One was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was called the Atomic City, which was where the atomic bombs were built. And last time I showed some pictures, or maybe the time before, of both the Amazon and the Mercedes complexes, 6,000 and 8,000 workers respectively, and how difficult it was in large workplaces. There were actually 40,000 people employed in Oak Ridge. A significant percentage of them were women. But because the facility was controlled by the government, and the government was allegedly pro-labor, the resistance was not immense. And they were able to organize all the different plants in Oak Ridge by fairly large majorities. Here's a picture of Oak Ridge, and I think this must have been taken from a plane, but this only gets a small area. So one thing about Operation Dixie is there was a claim that this was a big thing from both the American Federation of Labor and the CIO, and that lots of resources were put into it. And when I looked at the budgets from the organizations, that didn't turn out to be the case. The AFL spent about $350,000, and they terminated the drive. They thought they would be accepted quickly, that they would be the opposition to the so-called communist CIO. And then, as today, right-wingers called just about everybody communists, right? I guess even Kamala Harris is considered a communist by some people, which is more than a little amusing, right? So the CIO's drive was better funded, but they pledged $1 million. They put in $750,000 to start the campaign. Aside from union organizers from different unions, they hired directly 200 additional organizers. SOC is the Southern Organizing Committee, which was the official name for the Operation Dixie group. But by the end of 1946, funding and the number of organizers was cut in half. So the million was a fairly small amount. Very few gains were made. I mean, there were some initial places that were won, but basically, particularly in textile, the lead industry, there were less people unionized by the end of Operation Dixie than there had been before. And compared to steel, which was largely, but not totally, but largely funded by the United Mine Workers, they put almost $3 million in. So roughly 3 times as much as was put into Operation Dixie, which covered the whole South. They put 3 million in, plus they loaned 40 to 50 organizers and staff people. As opposed to Operation Dixie, they weren't worried about whether people were communists or radicals. They hired 60 experienced communist steelworkers, which was on the say-so of John L. Lewis. They had support from the National Negro Congress, which was the large civil rights umbrella organization to which almost all the local and national civil rights organizations belonged to, except the NAACP, which was a little bit more conservative. They used the halls in support of immigrant organizers from the International Workers Organization, which was a national organization having, and these figures are hard to substantiate, but they claim 9 million members, a large percentage of them foreign born, as were some of the workers, a lot of the workers who worked for steel. And they had support from coal miners everywhere. There are descriptions, some of which I have in the book, of armed marches of steel workers, of coal miners into steelworker company towns to keep the police from breaking up organizing rallies. Why did they choose textile? Well, the Operation Dixie was controlled by the right wing of the CIO. They thought that they would go to the one industry in the South that was all white, and that the left didn't have much of a presence. And as we've discussed previously, and I've argued, certain industries like coal at the far end had a lot of structural power. If coal miners struck, they couldn't be replaced. The mines couldn't be moved. The economy of the country, which was dependent on coal at the time, shut down. Textile is just the opposite. Textile is easily moved. Textile, which had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people up until a couple decades ago in the South, took up and moved first to China and then to places where the wages were even lower than China. It's easy to train. It's a low-skill job in textile, etc. So in order to organize an industry like that, you need broad outside support, associational power. So textile workers, for example, in the 70s and 80s organized in South Korea, but they were allied with auto and steel workers and lots of other people, and they knew that they needed them. Operation Dixie, which was headed by Van Bittner, who I described a fair amount in this chapter, not only didn't want communists involved, he didn't want anybody else involved. He denounced the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, which had been supported by the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. He attacked a New York group that was supporting them, which was chaired by the Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who was a Democrat, certainly not a revolutionary or a communist. And he not only refused support, but he denounced these people. So in the main industry where they absolutely needed associative power and allies, they rejected all that. They even rejected help from the CIO's own Political Action Committee, PAC, of which I think Bittner was the national vice president. So this is, and so Bittner and the people who ran Operation Dixie had very little understanding of how the organizing in the 30s and 40s had taken place and been successful. The other thing, they were very concerned with their image. So Bittner wanted the Operation Dixie to look Simon pure, and that's a quote from him. And these strategies never work. You know, you claim you get rid of all the radicals, you do this, you do that, and to create an image, and people will still attack you, right? We see that today. That was true then. So they hired almost all white males. 95% of them were veterans. They thought this looked good on the image, and most of them had no experience organizing. And this one person who I mentioned here, who they hired, had a physical education degree, had been a major in the Army Air Corps, and he had a letter of recommendation from the governor of South Carolina, who was himself something of a racist, right? So this seems like a strange way to organize. And as one starts reading through the organizing reports, the director, William Smith of North Carolina, which was the biggest textile, where we had the highest number of textile workers of any state in the country, even though he was fairly conservative and not at all militant, he was shocked by the fact that at their main target, the workers refused to work on the weekends. Well, as we know, if you're an organizer, you work, if you're in the middle of a campaign, you're working sort of 24/7 around the clock. And he keeps sending instructions that people can't take off weekends. So one reads all these reports and it seems like there's a little bit of craziness going on. The other thing is Operation Dixie was really terrible with respect to women. So women were numerous in many Southern industries, I mean, including a large percentage of the Oak Ridge employees. And the picture I had from a workplace was one of console and telephone operators who were overwhelmingly women at Oak Ridge. But in textile, 45% of the workers were female. They suffered a variety of gender-rooted discrimination and harassment, including sexual harassment, and this is documented in hundreds of complaints and examples. They're excluded from almost all skilled work and supervisory positions. And even when they did the same work, their pay was lower than that of men, as is documented by a lot of the investigations done at organizing campaigns. In spite of this, they did very little to recruit female organizers. And when they did, they treated them pretty terribly. So when requests were made for female organizers, the people running Operation Dixie paid little attention to it. So I've looked at the all the names and pictures of people on these organizing staffs for Operation Dixie. And, you know, this isn't exact science, right? Because you look at names and there may be a couple names that are ambiguous, right? And even pictures. I've done the same thing with respect to race, looking at the organizers in steel and the staff of the steel workers and the coal miners. And so exact figures aren't, you know, sometimes you absolutely can't tell from a picture what somebody is. But in North Carolina, which was the biggest concentration, there were no women hired by Operation Dixie. There were 2 women who were loaned from the TWA, the textile workers, and 2 from the food and tobacco workers. This is an industry, and in South Carolina, where there were 117,000 textile workers, 43% were white females, and they had no female organizers on staff. They paid the highest salaries and full expense accounts to inexperienced male organizers, and in instances where there were female and African American organizers, they were paid less than the white male counterparts and often didn't get expenses. And so there are lots of letters complaining about why they're not getting expenses when these inexperienced white male organizers are getting their expenses paid. So I mean, it seems like I'm beating a dead horse here, but clearly this doesn't seem to be the way to organize. And of course, on issues of race, they were pretty bad. And the interesting thing is, one reads the oral history reports, and I don't put much stock in oral history, but so most of these people running Operation Dixie at the highest level consider themselves liberals, right? So in the 1970s, if you're a liberal, you say, yeah, I supported civil rights all along, right? But then when you look at what they did in the 1940s, it's sort of shocking. So this one guy who's in charge of things in South Carolina, who's a district official, takes all the issues of the CIO news and gets rid of them, uses them for scrap paper on the floor because they have interracial pictures from a CIO convention. Another place, the people most likely to first join the union where there were interracial workforces were African American workers. And rather than taking this as a good thing, in this one case in Virginia, they're worried that they won't have white leadership if the whites aren't joining fast enough. And in some of the more left-wing unions, there was a concerted attempt to actually put Black workers in leadership positions. That was true in food and tobacco. That was in part true in mining, which wasn't that left a union. That was true in the West Coast and Longshore and in other places. So this was not the attitude of the people in Operation Dixie. And finally, the bureaucratic rigidity of Van Bittner and people running it is somewhat astounding. So Bittner instituted a policy of forcing everybody on his staff who signed up somebody for the union to pay a $1 initiation fee. Now, most unions didn't do this. They waived this initially. And the reason was, and this was particularly true in the South, a lot of workers were skeptical of the unions. They had paid initiation fees and then been abandoned by the unions. So the general thrust, and this was even of more conservative unions like the textile workers or the auto workers, they waived the initiation fees for the union until the union was actually organized and doing something for the workers. Bittner refused to allow anybody to be signed up unless they paid the initiation fee. And almost all the organizers rebelled about this, and he refused to accept that. Okay, so there are two things. One is, while it's good to be both supportive and enthusiastic about some of the stuff going on, we also have to have a little bit of skepticism. Show me. I'm not from Missouri, but people say, show me. So the UAW said they were going to pledge $40 million to organizing Southern auto plants, right? I don't know what the data is going to show, but let's see if they're going to do that, right? The Teamsters new leadership came in and said they were going to put a huge amount of resources into organizing Amazon. I don't know about every Amazon place, but all the feedback I've gotten from activists and the Teamsters says that not much has happened. So we'll see. So, and then I'll end on this. What are the lessons? And some of them in Ed Bruno's very short piece are listed there. So the real question is, what are the lessons that we need to draw for today, and who, if anybody, is doing things right, and what do we need to do to successfully organize the South in the foreseeable future? I'm going to stop right there and throw it open. Let's see.
Yeah, we already have a hand too. So the people are ready. So yeah, you can raise your hand, or if you don't want to come off mute or off camera, you can put your question in the chat, and I'll make sure I ask it from there. I'll turn it over to Chris A.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you. I wanted to address that last point. Just a personal thing. Our union, local 666 IBEW in Richmond, Virginia, just last month, voted on a bylaws change to waive our initiation fee. That was put forth by one of our organizers, citing the, like long time discrimination. It was meant to be a selective policy, and he cited that, and the reason for us removing it at this time was we just organized a bunch of manufacturers at Rhea Magnet Wire, and some of them are having, like, they saw the $24 initiation fee, and we're like, I can't do that exactly right now. We figured we might as well waive it, get them all in right away, and yeah, very proud of that.
Sounds good. So where exactly is this located that you're talking about? Where are you?
I'm in Richmond, Virginia. IBW 666, and Rhea Magnet Wire is in Ashland. Is the we just added manufacturing. That's yeah, our newest unionized workplace.
Thank you, Chris. I know that's I mean, the whole purpose of the SWA is around this question, so I know there's some good work going. Okay, Mama Shaki.
Greetings, everybody. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I just have a couple of thoughts about this Operation Dixie analysis, and that to me, I think is important. One of the approaches, I mean, generally we all agree that there was racism and sexism and a horrible approach by the organizers. But to me, I think even today, when we look at trying to organize the South and how to approach it, and it's still a delicate, sensitive thing in a way. The question of understanding the nature for the U.S. working class, the nature of this country, and how Black workers fit into it. Sometimes that's not our starting point. Our starting point is just a class analysis, and feeling that just if we are just anti-racist as a class, that we'll be able to overcome all of this history and organize better. And to me, I think there's a flaw in that approach. So in other words, there's not just one unified working class in the United States. the history of it is, the lands were stolen from the native people and they themselves were colonized. And then a labor force was imported in, Black workers, African workers, and those workers were also colonized. And so it shaped the labor of how the working, the process of how the working class developed in this country. And to me, it seems like the starting point of that understanding is not within the framework of how, organizers approached organizing the South in, the 40s and 50s. And even today, that understanding of the approach is not prevalent. So, in the South, you're dealing with, a structural resistance, but also, a white supremacist kind of colonizer resistance to the left and to unions, any kind of progressive, struggle in the Southern region. We're shaped by that. So to me, that understanding has to be our starting point, for organizing and building. So the centrality of the Black working class that we always allude to in Black Workers for Justice, is a real question, because it's not just a question of race, but it's a question of the position within the U.S. economy that, the Black people as an oppressed working class people have within the society, and the impact that has on organizing, the white working class in general. And I'll conclude this thought by saying this. I missed last week, unfortunately, but I was able to read the chapter. But one of the interesting things that I think was pointed out there was the was the question of the like, for example, with the unemployed councils, or later on with the other social movements across the South that are alluded to in that chapter. The approach then of trying to bring forward or proceed on the basis of understanding, for example, the civil rights movement, its impact, how to approach the question of race in the South, more than just racism, but, a colonized, deeper oppression, understanding that point. I don't think that we've had that in our organizing and approach. So, when the Communist Party, for example, and most of the leftists in the CIO, before they were driven out, it seems like the most successful organizing that happened was from the Communist Party, for example, that understood, at least in part of its history, understood the national question and how it impacted Black people. And so how to approach dealing with, the question of dealing with, whether it's the Scottsboro Boys or organizing the tenant, the sharecroppers union, those campaigns that were successful, to a degree. I did like the way Mike laid out the structural problems with, the sharecroppers union being able to be a real force. But still, the successfulness of that organizing from that understanding, I think, to me, is a lesson. And that was driven out of the CIO and of the unions in general, driving the left out, but having any kind of understanding about the centrality of Black workers and the nature of their oppression as workers being, that of national oppression and not just class oppression. I think those are, important points for us to maybe study a little bit more and to help shape our analysis and understanding of how to proceed with organizing the South. And I don't think we've had that much. So, I appreciate the detail in which Mike has laid out quite a bit, in this book around some of these kind of questions. But anyway, I'll stop there, and so others can can join. Thank you. Sorry for my meandering around there.
No,
No,
that was good and welcomed. I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, that's, I think that Ashok raises key questions. So, so on the one hand, there are these class differences and they come up even within the Black community. So I've read a lot of things on Memphis. So at the time of the initial sanitation workers strike in '68, the whole Black community supported the sanitation workers. It was sort of a civil rights struggle. But once the elite in the community were incorporated into the power structure in Memphis, they turned on Black workers. Same thing. I don't know as much about Atlanta, but I've had people make that argument to me about that's what happened in Atlanta also. So I think that the important thing in terms of racial oppression is also how it comes up in a class way. So in Memphis, the Black workers were still and probably still in many places today in a lower rung of the working class concentrated there. And that, so those types of special demands for access, when I worked in a plant in Chicago, the fight of access to African Americans, and today it's much more too. There are Latinos who are kept out of these positions. There are women, but the fight to open up access to these more skilled jobs and higher level jobs has to be a continual part of the struggle. And I think that, you look at some of the campaigns, and the big ones in the auto plants, the one in Mississippi, where the UAW lost in Canton, Mississippi, where they lost so badly, and the plant was majority African-American employees. So the union must have done something wrong, right? In terms of dealing with people's special grievances and whatnot. So I think Shockey is right. You have to look at special grievances, special types of oppression that people have, as well as the common issues that people have in common. And I think that successful organizing has to do both of those things.
Yeah, thank you for that comment and for the response, Mike. We have three people with their hands up. This is good. Jim Wren, and then we'll go to Ollie, then Cal.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for this discussion. Going off what Shockey said and going to my experience and my study of the Operation Dixie among the tobacco workers campaign in East North Carolina, which I've done a lot of work on. I think the key is the CIO succeeded, or Operation Dixie, to see where the unions like the FTA linked the struggle in the plants to Black political power. And I gotta say that the FTA, going back, you're talking about the sharecroppers union, Alabama Sharecroppers Union led into Yucapagua. Yucapagua was the initial union that organized the workers at R.J. Reynolds, and this was quite successful movement because it linked the union to the struggle of Black political power, electing the first Black city council people in Winston-Salem and then in Wilson, North Carolina, etc. That's a lesson that Black Workers for Justice has learned. Again, in the 80s is linking that struggle to Black political power. So that's a key. I think what Ashaki's saying, that's a key element that needs to be considered. I think in Memphis, in the early days, in the 40s, you had black workers. You had initial element of class solidarity around Memphis due to the CIO that was unique in those time period, but it was still black workers within those again the FTA out there, Local 19, the furniture workers in Memphis, and then black workers who were in the UAW and the rubber workers. They eventually had an impact on the sanitation workers' struggle in '68. So all that I think needs to be taken into account. Now, on another point you raised about the initiation fee, I think from our point of view, organizing, I would not oppose an initiation fee, because I think you got this mindset that people don't have a union until you get a contract, and that's a wrong approach. You need to start building a union right away. So we start organizing and collecting dues before you ever have a contract. And so when I did my research on the FTA victory at China American in Rocky Mount in 1946, I looked at Operation Dixie archives at Duke University, and you can see this long list of workers who paid their $1 initiation fee to join the union even before they had the election in those plants. And I thought that was a good thing. I thought so. As far as initiation fee, I think that's a good thing, because it teaches people to put something into the organization. They organize a union, not waiting for some union organizer to give them a contract and then they start paying dues. We don't agree with that. So on that point, I take issue with what you said. But anyway, so that's my take on Operation Dixie in Eastern North Carolina.
No, I don't have to respond to everything, but the thing about the initiation fees, that you can't be rigid. And I think that, right, the other side of collecting dues, I worked in a plant where we had a weekly newspaper, and we collected money from people around the plant to support the newspaper, and it wasn't, we were something of an opposition group within the union. So I think money shows good faith. One of the things that had happened at this point in the South is that people had been let down so many times that when the organizers thought that the initiation fee should be waived until they could show something. And that doesn't mean a contract, but until there's some organization or something going on. Any case, Jim, the extra information you added, I think, is pretty interesting.
Okay, thank you. But by the way, just for the record, for people who say Operation Dixie was a failure, if you Google Operation Dixie, you will see the North Carolina historical marker that we have erected in Rocky Mount to recognize the Union victory election of the China American Tobacco Plant in 1946, which began the Eastern Down East organizing effort. So it shows that Operation Dixie was a success, at least with black workers. So in terms of the narrative, we able to scoop that historical, whatever you want to call it. So if you Google Operation Dixie, you'll see our historical marker in Rocky Mountain.
Got two other hands up. Just want
to. Ali and Kyle, and then we'll go back to Mama Shaki. Maybe you all could say a question or comment and one thing, and then we'll give Mike time to engage with it, respond, that kind of thing.
Sure. So mine is both a comment and a question. The Operation Dixie showed the failure of people from the outside trying to organize a workplace. Now we have many workplaces that are self-organizing and or taking advice of outside organizers instead of letting them lead. And I think that's the way you should go. You shouldn't be going around trying to tell someone how to organize. You should give them the tools to organize for them, or let them. No, sorry, you should give them the tools to let them self-organize and guide them when they need guidance, when they ask for guidance. In your opinion, in the way Operation Dixie turned out, do you think it would have been better to have more, more left-leaning people helping, or do you believe that it might have ended up being a hindrance, especially with the way the movement was back then in the 30s and 40s?
So a lot of these people were experienced, who they excluded. So if we look at the situation in steel, for example, the coal miners wanted to organize steel, but they didn't have any contacts in the steel industry. They wanted to organize it because the steel companies owned a lot of coal mines, and they also had a lot of leverage in terms of keeping the union out. So that these coal miners thought if they organized steel, they'd be in a better situation. So they were willing to put money and organizers, but it was really mostly communists who had been in these steel towns for a long time, had lots of contacts. It was people from these immigrant organizations that had ties to people in the plant. So I mean, we all agree that having people organizing on the inside is really key. But I mean, I think that Operation Dixie should not have chosen textile. They should have started in wood. The woodworkers, which was a disorganized union, and other unions were organizing woodworkers and turning them over to the union. But in the woodworkers were half black and half white in the South. And they won almost every election that they contended and had vibrant locals. And there were several 100,000 woodworkers meaning, people who cut down the trees, who work in sawmills. In the South, there was a lot of dangerous stuff. There was wood that was grown in swamps where there were lots of snakes, where they had to send people in to cut down the wood. So I think if they had organized woodworkers first, that they would have been way better off. I think there's a role for people on the outside too, but I was in the auto workers for many years, and the people would go there and hand out cards at the gate and had very minimal contact inside the plants. That's clearly not the way to do it, right? So, yeah, so I think if they hadn't excluded leftists and experienced organizers, that they would have had a better chance of success. I think textile, as I argue in the book, had a better chance in 36 and 37 than it had in 46. And they tried to make nice of the employers. They said, just like the UAW did initially in Chattanooga, put us in there and we'll have cooperative relationships with the employer. And that almost never works, right? So I think those are some of the lessons that we can learn, and we can see some of these same things repeating themselves in the not that distant past. But let me just say, I think, in terms of what to do now, these things should be open for discussion. I've looked fairly carefully at a lot of things during the period that my book looks at, but there's lots of assessments and different types of things to try in the current period.
Okay, Kyle, we can jump right to you.
Hey, thanks. Hey, all. Thanks, Mike, for taking the time to put all this information together. It's very enlightening. In some of the earlier chapters, you mentioned the tension that existed between the AFL and the CIO regarding the strategy of trade unionism versus industrial unionism. I'm curious if this tension played out during Operation Dixie, and also if it continues to play out today. I'm wondering if one strategy proves to be more successful. Is the tension destructive? Is dual unionism viable these days? I'm curious how that plays out now. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that unions with very different types of constituencies, or when the workforce is fragmented, what I've written is balkanized, makes it much more difficult for solidarity. So let's start with the railroad union, which has railroad. Most of railroad employees are unionized. There are 14 different unions, various skill levels. The unions have a history of fighting with each other and not able to cooperate. And I think that that's one of the main reasons they were able to be steamrolled by the Biden administration, even though a majority of workers had voted to reject the contract that the administration wanted. There's an opposition group, Railroad Workers United, whose program is to unite all these unions. I mean, and this was Eugene Debs's strategy in the American Railroad Union to unify everybody. And the interesting thing, we also have to notice how things have changed. So I look at the websites of all these different unions. Up through the 60s, you had the higher level unions that were all white and discriminatory. And I look at the engineers union, and the president of one local who's on the website is a Black female engineer. So in one sense, there's more, it isn't full integration, but there's much more, I don't like to use the word diversity because that, but there's certainly much more integration than there used to be in these unions. But I think dividing all the things that divide workers in the same industry and the same plant up don't help to let people act together. You know, and so I wonder also about, so the auto workers union has, I think, more people now organized on college campuses than they do in automobile factories, right? Is that a bad thing? I mean, it's not a bad thing that these people are unionized, but it's a strange type of position for an industrial union to be in. So I think that one has to worry about balkanization, bifurcation. You know, you can say the same thing with the two longshore unions. The East Coast Longshore Union is separate from the West Coast. The West Coast, the International Longshoremen Workers Union has a history of more militants and being more left-wing. But, you know, when they got ready and were about to go on strike, shippers were transferring as much as they could to the East Coast. And then when the ILU, the International Longshoremen's Union, was threatening a strike, they started transferring stuff back to the West Coast. So I think anytime you have separations among workforces like that, you lose leverage, and it makes things more difficult. I mean, that only answers part of your question, but I think that that's certainly one part that we look at the scene today, and you know, the fragmentation that even among those workers who are organized, which doesn't include by far, obviously, most workers. Most workers are unorganized. I don't know if that gets to how much of what you were asking that gets to.
I guess if I can take away that whatever lowers or whatever improves solidarity is the way to go. Like sometimes that's usually involves getting the entire workplace on the same page.
Yeah, I think it was easier. So I worked for International Harvester, which was originally organized by the Farm Equipment Workers, which was a communist-led union. But the local I was in was organized right after World War II by the UAW. But the skilled tradespeople and everybody else in the plant were all in the same union. And that made it much more easy for us to exert leverage on the company than if there had been separate skilled trades unions in the same plant. And even though there were conflicts between the different sets of workers, we were all in the union together, and the fights were internal to the local, not over jurisdiction or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we can go on to Russ, then Tim.
Calling on me?
Yes, sir. The ball's in your court.
Okay. Maybe the answer's obvious given all their other flaws, but can you say anything about how the organizers from Operation Dixie either avoided or tried to incorporate elements of shop floor activity in their organizing drives, or was it really a question of we're here to get cards signed and then have a NLRB election, and until we, win an NLRB election, we can't do anything? That's maybe oversimplification, but still, was there a level in some of these industries or a pattern of shop floor activity on which union drives could have built? Maybe not in textile, but maybe in other areas. I thought the most stimulating, or one of the most stimulating things in your essay was the road not taken of building in the cities where there was already, different elements of union organization, which would have allowed for a lot of associative strength. I had no idea that was a way to think about it, and unfortunately, as you say, it wasn't the road taken.
Yeah, I think that aside from picking the industry, if they had concentrated on cities where there was already organization, they would have done better. So one example I talk about there, and this is why I think company opposition to unions in the workplace makes a big difference. I don't think most of the noise that the press talks about from governors and Republican states and all that carries much weight or influence with anybody. And as an example that I talk about, I think I had a slide from last week. So Laurel, Mississippi, most of the workers got organized, and in 47 or 48, the last place that was unorganized was a textile place. And Senator Bilbo, who we just mentioned, and Congressman Rankin came there and denounced the union as communists and said they were race mixers and all that stuff. And the workers, including the overwhelming majority of whites, still voted 5 or 6 to 1 for the union because they saw the benefits that the union had brought in other workplaces in Laurel, including, Laurel, I think, is still a plywood center. At least it was a few years ago when I checked things out there. So I think having both the example and the support from other unions makes a tremendous amount of difference. And so Operation Dixie, and there was even somebody in Operation Dixie, one of the regional directors, who said that the focus should be shifted towards the urban areas or the areas around them. And I think he was from Atlanta and thought that you should fan out from Atlanta to organize people. So, yeah, so it's interesting. In some of the cities in the South, I mean, and Memphis is a prime example, were as organized as any city in the North. Once they made the breakthroughs, particularly some of the big places like the Firestone tire manufacturing and whatnot, it was much easier to organize other workers. And workers at that time would come to other companies' picket lines and help out. So yeah, they had other options.
My original question though was there like shop floor activity in the, independent of the unions, or in advance of, union drives that they could have based themselves on, or did they flee from that sort of thing? Did they?
Yeah, no,
encourage
I think they hesitated from that sort of thing, and that's always been the conservative strain within the labor movement. We saw that in the UAW for decades, that they wanted to be cooperative. We saw it in the turn of the century with Samuel Gompers making his speaking tours and speaking with manufacturers in the South, and even in the 1930s, when textile mills during the 36 and 37 were voting overwhelmingly for unions, the textile workers organizing discouraged strikes, and they discouraged activism. And I think that was the approach in Operation Dixie too. So even in Birmingham, the more conservative people in the CIO supported Bull Connor, who became famous later during the civil rights period. So they were always trying to get in good with the wrong people, and that, I think, discouraged workplace activism, work stoppages, organizing that led to something. So, yeah, I think there was a certain, and there are a couple examples. I don't know how many I remember what I cite in the book, but there are certainly a couple where workers got fed up, went on strike on their own, and then had an election afterwards, which they won. And that happened. So workers at the Ford River Rouge plant, which was one of the most resistant places, couldn't get a vote or the company to agree to anything, and they went on a strike. And as part of the settlement, Ford agreed to a vote, which the union then won overwhelmingly. So, but I think you're right. The approach was hand out cards, get an election, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, great question, Russ, and thank you for the response. We have time for one more question, and it's perfect because we have one more hand. So I'll turn it over to Tim, and then we'll go from there. Then conclude.
Thank you, sir, and thank you all for having me. I am not affiliated with any unions, but it is a huge priority for me to learn about how you all work. My background is in arts, and I kind of stumbled into the architecture field after getting an art scholarship for college. Long story short, I've always been a kind of sole practitioner making drawings. And when I can during construction projects, I like to roll up my sleeves and help scrape paint off baseboards if the painting item wasn't in the budget, just to help the clients get their projects to be more affordable. And the workers have always appreciated me for that. And also just doing drawings that the contractors recognized as reliable. And I didn't put notes on the drawing like verify in field because I don't have time to get the details right and the dimensions right. So anyway, really appreciate what y'all are doing because y'all have the knowledge in your hands and you make this country what it is. And so that's just me. The reason I need to learn so much about how unions work is because we have to get even more organized with the social movements, with the climate movements, because everything is coming to a head. This is the moment for us because we haven't had this much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in 33 million years. That's when Antarctica was separating from Africa, and the ocean currents were really starting to go and helped cool the earth down into what gave us dependable growing seasons and human settlements and the ability to industrialize. But ever since we industrialized from colonization, and back to Ashaki's point, the class struggle within the labor, I want to resonate to what I've become a climate activist once I realized that we are in a climate emergency, and I joined a group called Declare Emergency, which the strategy is civil rights, based on civil rights, where we risk arrest, we disrupt the public. It's kind of a luxury to do. I can have patient clients that can wait on me. I can start living off my savings, but I have to do this because we're in a closing window where if we can organize, if we can take back control of the production side of the economy, that means we can decide based on our values what is socially important and necessary to make. And it's basically what we're all doing, but not for the sole purpose of economic growth for the bosses. Everybody wants return on investment. This whole fantasy of economic growth is inherited from colonizations necessarily having only being viable because of cheap labor and cheap materials from exploitation and plunder. But the capitalist system has moved all that.
Tim, sorry to...
Yeah, I guess my question is, are y'all at all concerned about the climate? Because if it's too hot to work and the global economic system unravels in our children's lifetime, and we all have to look to each other and create community, can we get organized now to start turning that inevitable breakdown and unraveling and revolution in pro-social, pro-democratic, pro-mutual aid for each other? And that's my question. Can we get organized sooner than later? Thanks. And I can send receipts for everything I just said.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there are people active, on the call on a number of different fronts, connecting the struggles in the workplace to the question of the environment, and see, work in the labor movement as part of the environmental justice movement. But it's 8:16, and we have allotted for the call to 8:15. So I want to be respectful of people's time, but also this is the last session, with Mike. And so first I want to thank him for being committed and dedicated to providing this level of detailed education to the Southern Workers Assembly, and answering questions, putting together PowerPoints, really digging deep into what it means for us today. So not just telling us what happened, but going into detail about what are the key lessons. So much appreciation to you, Mike, and for everyone on the call. These have all been recorded too. So, once you log off of this meeting, this won't be the last time you could engage or interact with the discussions. All three have been recorded and will be made available to the SWA network. But I do want to, we're a few minutes over, but maybe just 2-3 more minutes, allow Mike to, share some closing remarks about the session, what we should leave with, that kind of thing. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you briefly, and thank you for taking the time over these 3 weeks to engage with us.
Yeah, no, actually, this has been my pleasure. I don't have any summary particular, but I'm happy. Someone who spent a long time trying to organize people and working in plant and other industries. I'm just much more enthusiastic about talking to people who were doing stuff on the ground than academic conferences, which I also go to. So this has been my pleasure, and I think all the sessions have been pretty lively with people thinking about things and having things to say. So for me, this is great. Be happy to do more. You mentioned the PowerPoints. That isn't something that I'm that slick in. I'm retired, but when I would teach these big lecture courses, I would usually have one of my students help me with the PowerPoints. So when I don't have somebody, it sort of gets a little crude. So hopefully that's been helpful too. I just wish everybody good luck, and never know when a single spark will start the forest fire. So we look forward to this, right?
Yes, let's all, come off mute, give a big appreciation to Mike. And we'll most certainly apply the lesson. So thank you, and more of this will be coming from the SWA, and we'll coordinate and we'll send out, a brief, kind of survey on feedback about the webinars, how they were structured, participation, what worked, what didn't work, that kind of thing. So thank you again, Mike. Thank you everyone for participating over the 3 weeks, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot.
Appreciate you, Mike. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mike.
Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Peace out, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.